Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker. Immigration is a hot topic, and many have voiced concerns about what role America, and in particular Christians, play in offering assistance to those displaced by war. For many, this is a political issue, but for some, it calls into question, what if someone of a different faith, one that may be in conflict to my own, moves into my city? As believers, what does the Bible tell us how we're to treat the stranger living in our midst? Our next guest, Shawn Smucker, is the author of The Day the Angels Fell, Christianity Today's 2018 Fiction Book of the Year, and its sequel, The Edge of Over There, released in July. He lives with his wife and 6 children in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. You can find him online at ShawnSmucker.com or follow him at Shawn Smucker on Twitter. Here to discuss his latest release, Once We Were Strangers, What Friendship with a Syrian Refugee Taught Me About Loving My Neighbor, is Shawn Smucker. Shawn, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here, Rabbi.
Well, it's an honor to have you here. This is such an important issue, and one that you have approached delicately with love, grace, and faith. And that was something that is deep-seated within you. So when were those seeds planted? What led you to become this really well-renowned ghostwriter and an author in your own right under your own name with this, your first nonfiction, bearing your name as the sole author?
Well, I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and that's where I live now. My ancestors have been here for 13 or 14 generations, all Amish, going back to when they fled here from Germany and Switzerland in the 1700s. So the roots of faith go very deep in my family, and there's a really strong sense of community here for me, a strong sense of family and of belonging. And so as I grew up, my parents were not Amish. My grandparents actually left the Amish when my parents were very young. So I didn't grow up Amish, but I had many Amish relatives that I hung out with a lot. And my dad became a pastor when I was just a really small boy. So I grew up in the church. I grew up learning about Jesus and loving Jesus. And that was a really important part of my childhood.
As a PK, pastor's kid, and with a very deep conviction, the Amish, the Mennonites, very convicted, the Quakers, very convicted to a way of life which is very community-based. I would say that in the modern day, it probably resembles more of what Acts chapter 2 described than any single group within the faith community. I've always said that if you have to call yourself an Acts chapter 2 church, you're probably not one. But growing up in Pennsylvania myself, knowing of the great community in the Amish world, although they have interesting dynamics as far as family is concerned. I've interviewed people growing up Amish and what it was like to leave, the difficulty there was in leaving. It's both cultural, it's kind of maybe the closest parallel to Judaism in the fact that it's not only just your faith system, bloodline, but it's cultural, it's a way of life. And it has some parallels in a tight community, not encouraging outsiders because outsiders tend to cause us to assimilate.
Right.
And assimilation is the anathema to the Amish culture. And if you look in Deuteronomy, it was the anathema to the Jewish culture as well, that we were not supposed to intermarry, otherwise we would take on other gods. That's even a relevant conversation, dialogue today, as I myself am a Jewish believer. have I left my faith and assimilated because I accepted Jesus as my Messiah? And I'm here to tell you, I was born a Jew, raised a Jew, live as a Jew, and I'll die as a Jew. And just because I put my faith in the Jewish Messiah only kind of makes me more Jewish than less Jewish. So as you saw this dynamic in your own family, you saw some cultural differences, and it seems that that cultural difference and bridging those cultural gaps kind of is the setup for this once we were strangers story, that you had in your heart already the ability to accept and try to understand the dynamic differences between points of view without condemnation, without judgment, but with a heart for understanding. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and I don't think I've even thought of that before. Growing up sort of outside the Amish community, but having such close ties to it, yeah, they certainly have their issues, that's for sure. And I think one of the things that really is something they're always trying to work through is this idea of shunning, and you know how appropriate is it, how effective is it. I think that seeing it from my perspective, seeing how shunning works its way out, has had a major impact on my own faith and my interactions with people who I don't agree with or people from other faiths. Because from my perspective, I just haven't seen that be an effective way of maintaining community or even keeping a strong faith. You know, I think shunning is something that's definitely rooted in fear, a fear that our culture will change too much, or you know, that if we just let people think what they want, that we'll lose a part of us somehow. So yeah, I think you're right. I think that Amish background has definitely influenced the way that I've approached life, and specifically the writing of this book.
You know, the circumcision of your heart is different than the circumcision of others' hearts, because you grew up in a multi-faith environment within the same faith system. The Amish,
Right.
the Amish are not pagans, they're not heathens, they're not idol worshippers. They're actually devoted to a very edifying lifestyle for those that agree with them. I think Christianity, in a lot of ways, is the same way, is that this is the only army in the world that shoots its wounded. And Christianity has gotten a pretty bad reputation for the way we handle people who may have been in leadership and had an issue, and we put them out. Rather than take the route of restoration, we take the route of rejection. And that in itself is shunning.
Right.
And that's really not supported in the Bible except during a process. I think the process that we might refer to would be Matthew 18, which is how to handle an offense and the process in which you handle that offense, which I've never seen actually played out except in my own life when I applied the principle to individuals in my life and approached it that way, because I was given the instruction, and who was I to reject? This is how you are to approach someone who has offended you or hurt you, and this is what you do if you can't win them over. And you ultimately wind up, as the last resort, is bringing them before the congregation and putting them out if you can't win them over that way. So maybe it's a matter of a little bit of lack of biblical literacy, that we seem to apply just the Sunday lesson, but we don't really mine for the gold ourselves within the pages of Scripture.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think, you know, that idea of shunning in Matthew 18, I mean, as I understand it, was really meant to be practiced within our community, right? Our community of faith. And I think you're right. What we've done in many cases is we take this idea of shunning, or this idea of sort of removing someone from the community, and we apply it to other people or people groups or other religions in our culture who are not part of our faith community. And we sort of see it as a way of, I don't know, maybe cleansing our midst of people who disagree with us or who don't live like us or believe like us. And I'm not sure that that's the proper way to go about it.
You know, I see the extreme where we have this ministry of tolerance where pastors are inviting imams and rabbis coming in to read from their sacred text. The rabbi is reading from the same sacred text you and I read from, just only the first half of it. But the imam comes in quoting from the Quran, and always a presentation that is to win the hearts of the people, to say we're a ministry of peace, we are a peaceful people, that even though Muhammad wrote about war, we're not here to implement that agenda, and we're not here to come into your community and take it over, even though we see evidence of that in 55 contiguous nations surrounding Israel. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic that's played out in your life. As you read and have read, based on this friendship that you developed, America's debate on immigration, refugee assistance, looking at this from a heart of love and a heart of grace and a heart of mercy, how do we process this vetting and this issue of what's a real refugee and what's real persecution, and should we be a safe haven for those like my own people that were persecuted by the Cossacks, and therefore my grandparents came to America in 1904 because the Cossacks ran them out, or my father's family who in the 30s came from Hungary because the communists were coming and they were going to run them out, or the refugees from the Holocaust who were going to be murdered just because they were Jewish. Do you have to have your life threatened, or do you have to come from a culture of threatening in order for us to be a safe haven? And this refugee situation, is that different than what we're looking at, these caravans and these open border policies? And is there a difference? Are we slicing the same pie to, you know, I like my rye bread sliced really, really thin. All right, you know, are we taking this issue and are we slicing it too much as a faith community, or are we completely rejecting it as a faith community, or are we just acting out of complete ignorance and we don't study it enough to make our own informed decisions?
I think, I mean, I'm not an expert on immigration. I've learned a lot about refugees. As sort of a specific slice, if you will, of the immigration sector. And what I've found is that from the people that I've spoken with, most people just don't know enough about refugees specifically. So, you know, for example, that it takes a refugee 3 to 4 years to go through the process to be accepted by the UN who oversees it, or the fact that refugees can't choose the country that they go to. You know, they may be given preference if they have family members somewhere, but they can't say, well, I want to go to America, or I want to go to Germany, or I want to go to the Netherlands. They're basically allocated by the UN to various countries. So you know, there's just so many facts like that have brought a lot of relief to my mind when it comes to refugees entering the United States. And I think that as a Christian, what it comes down to for me is trying to understand what Jesus meant when he said to love your neighbor as yourself, you know, the story of the Good Samaritan. And I mean, I can understand issues of national security, and I can understand the concern that people have. The world is not a safe place. And so, you know, I couldn't sit here and say that no harm will come to us if we welcome people into our country. But I think that as a believer, what must come first in my mind is not security. I can't be seeking my own security, but I need to follow Christ. And I think Christ led us in this way when he told the story of the Good Samaritan. And so, in my interactions with Muhammad and other refugees in Lancaster, in my volunteering with Church World Service as a refugee resettlement organization, I just continually try and ask myself, would Jesus do this? Would Jesus welcome people? Would he want us to welcome people in? Even if they may come from areas or countries or groups or religions that we might classify as being enemies. What is our duty as Christians to these people?
You bring up an interesting point, and I was unaware that a refugee could not pick their country of entry. So there's a lot written about jihad through immigration and migration. The concept is that there are those that deliberately are targeting Europe or targeting Africa or targeting other countries, but the true refugee status, not those who are trying to make their way across our border illegally, but those who are entered into the refugee assistance program don't have a choice. So they're not coming here with an agenda like we might think that they are.
Right.
They may be recruited into an agenda. They may be placed into a community that does have, and we'll talk about Muslims in particular, that do have a mosque and do get placed into a Muslim community under the heading of an imam or there may be a local school system within that community. Lancaster would be an interesting place for a halal market or for just because of the dynamics of the culture within Lancaster itself. But you had an interesting encounter, and you met a man, Muhammad. How did that kind of, if you will, and we're going to go to break in about 3 or 4 minutes, but before we go to break, kind of set the whole kind of stage for us. Act 1, Scene 1 of Shawn Smucker meeting Muhammad.
Yeah, so I was writing up some community spotlight blog posts for Church World Service on some various refugees and asylum seekers who had found their way to Lancaster County. Just trying to introduce them to the community, trying to share their stories. And as I was going about this, it was 2016, and Syria was starting to kind of hit the front pages as far as the civil war there and especially the civilian casualties that were starting to mount up. And so I asked CWS if there was any way that I could meet up with a Syrian refugee to write a spotlight on them. And in the meantime, I had also been sort of playing around with the idea of possibly writing a book. And so they introduced me to Muhammad. And the first day that I met him, I'll never forget, we were in a small office at the CWS offices. And he was sitting there. We were talking through a translator. He could speak English, but it was pretty rough. So we thought for our first meeting, we'd have a translator with us. And at that point, I explained to him the process of what I wanted to do and that there might be the possibility of a book. But I told him, it's also very possible with the way the book industry, publishing industry goes, that nothing would come of this. And I remember he looked at me and said, well, that's impossible. It's impossible for nothing to come of this because we're friends now. And that had such a huge impact on me that he would accept me, a Western American Christian, and I'm sure that he's heard horror stories of how we treat Muslims or think about Muslims, and the fact that he didn't give in to those stereotypes of Westerners but was willing to befriend me, that had a big impact on me.
So he came with a full knowledge or had acquired a knowledge based on people's attitudes. Now, did he dress in Muslim attire, or was he dressed just like you and I?
He was dressed just like you and I.
And was he working? Had they found him a job, found him a place to live, and he was a contributing member of society? He was kind of the ideal refugee, got placed into a community, got assistance in finding a place to live, a place to work, all of that. How did that come about?
Yeah, so he was, I believe when we first met, he had not started working yet. He was here for about 2 or 3 months before he started working. But I think it's also important to note that the airfare for him and his family to fly here and their initial lodging, their upfront expenses are all things that refugees have to repay. So they take a promissory note, and then they begin to repay that as soon as they get work. So he got work about a month after we met and quickly was promoted to shift manager. It was at a small dry cleaner close by.
Another point that I was completely unaware of is that the refugees have to repay so that they have a vested interest in becoming productive and not so much assimilating but integrating into the society in which they're placed. We're talking with Shawn Smucker, a very interesting, enlightening, and educational conversation about his new book, Once We Were Strangers, What Friendship with a Syrian Refugee Taught Me About Loving My Neighbor. The immigration issue, the refugee issue are complete. Even my own lack of understanding of the process and the system led Shawn to a dynamic relationship with someone who he started out interviewing and ultimately formed a personal relationship through the love of Jesus, that he was able to find in his heart a way to open himself up and be transparent and form a friendship, and he chronicles that friendship in this book. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk more about the unusual friendship formed between Shawn Smucker and Muhammad. Shalom, I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and I've got a question for you. What do you think they're doing with your DNA? Oh, you know that 23andMe kit that you sent off, and you got back that report that told you you were Irish, you were French, you were Jewish? Wonder who's interested in that information. It's not like you've sent it off to a database with millions of other people and they can steal your identity, and who would really be interested in that information other than you? Well, maybe your friends and family, but there's one, yes, one, who is so interested in your DNA that it would be something that would make you afraid. And that is Satan himself. Why would Satan be interested in your DNA? Because there is a Y chromosome marker that determines whether or not you are in the line of Aaron. That's right, the biblical line of Aaron the priest. That's because if the priesthood comes back and the high priest takes his role as the head of the Sanhedrin, they will be the ones to call for the return of Jesus. Well, what can they do with your DNA? Well, there are 40-plus countries weaponizing DNA today. And imagine if Satan could weaponize your DNA and use that Y chromosome marker to take out the line of the high priest, then Jesus doesn't come back. That is the plot behind the best-selling book, The Codex, now out in second edition on Kindle, $2.99, also available in paperback. This is a biblical thriller beyond comparison that's going to take you on an incredible journey to understand what they could do with your DNA. I also want to encourage you to visit our website, ignitinganation.com, and click on special offers. There you're going to find the yellow cover of this book, The 7 Laws of Abundant Living, Lessons Learned from the Tree of Life. We're going to take you on a journey in the Garden of Eden to the seed, the ground, all the way out to the fruit that reveals things of the natural, that God is trying to reveal supernatural truths. Contained within these pages are 7 laws and 7 lessons within each law. They're going to take you on an incredible journey of understanding about the life you live and the fruit you bear. I want to encourage you to click on that yellow cover. We're going to ask for your email. Now, we won't send you spam because spam is not kosher, but we will send you the first chapter of this book. I want to encourage you to get 7 Laws of Abundant Living, Lessons Learned from the Tree of Life. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it on Barnes & Noble. You can get it Books A Million, wherever great Christian books are sold. Take this journey with me. to the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, and to the tree of life we see again at the river of life. Get your copy today. Shalom, I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and I've got a question for you. What do you think they're doing with your DNA? Oh, you know that 23andMe kit that you sent off, and you got back that report that told you were Irish, you were French, you were Jewish? Wonder who's interested in that information. It's not like you've sent it off to a database with millions of other people and they can steal your identity, and who would really be interested in that information other than you? Well, maybe your friends and family, but there's one, yes, one who is so interested in your DNA that it would be something that would make you afraid. And that is Satan himself. Why would Satan be interested in your DNA? Because there is a Y chromosome marker that determines whether or not you are in the line of Aaron. That's right, the biblical line of Aaron the priest. That's because if the priesthood comes back and the high priest takes his role as the head of the Sanhedrin, they will be the ones to call for the return of Jesus. Well, what can they do with your DNA? Well, there are 40-plus countries weaponizing DNA today. And imagine if Satan could weaponize your DNA and use that Y chromosome marker to take out the line of the high priest, then Jesus doesn't come back. That is the plot behind the best-selling book, The Codex, now out in second edition, on Kindle, $2.99, also available in paperback. This is a biblical thriller beyond comparison that's going to take you on an incredible journey to understand what they could do with your DNA. I also want to encourage you to visit our website, ignitingnation.com, and click on special offers. There you're going to find the yellow cover of this book, The 7 Laws of Abundant Living, Lessons Learned from the Tree of Life. We're going to take you on a journey in the Garden of Eden to the seed, the ground, all the way out to the fruit that reveals things of the natural that God is trying to reveal supernatural truths. Contained within these pages are 7 laws and 7 lessons within each law. They're going to take you on an incredible journey of understanding about the life you live and the fruit you bear. I want to encourage you to click on that yellow cover. We're going to ask for your email. Now, we won't send you spam because spam is not kosher, but we will send you the first chapter of this book. I want to encourage you to get 7 Laws of Abundant Living, Lessons Learned from the Tree of Life. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it on Barnes & Noble. You can get it at Books A Million, wherever great Christian books are sold. Take this journey with me to the Tree of Life in the Garden of Eden and to the Tree of Life we see again at the River of Life. Get your copy today. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Shawn Smucker, author of the newly released book, Once We Were Strangers, What Friendship with a Syrian Refugee Taught Me About Loving My Neighbor. Shawn, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
Shawn, you have already in the first segment enlightened our audience into a deeper understanding of a couple of I think misperceptions on our part about how the refugee program works. And the difference between the refugee program and what we're talking about is general open borders or the border issues we have today. This is a very unique program that is managed by the United Nations and requires a whole lot of work on the part of those who are seeking asylum from a country that's at war, or there's certain persecution, whether it be religious or political. As we're looking at Syria, that's a very obvious one. And you had the opportunity to interview Muhammad as a part of a series you were doing. And what took place during that interview opened up an ongoing dialogue.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting because we all have our preconceived ideas of what other people are going to be like, right? So, you know, Muhammad probably thought a certain thing about me, and I had certain concerns about him. He recently told me a really interesting story about he moved to Michigan this spring, and since he's been out there, they started taking English classes with a family, and this family happens to be Jewish. And so he was so happy to talk. I was talking to him on the phone, and he was so excited. I kind of got the feeling that he growing up in the Middle East, had a particular view of what a Jewish family might be like or might think of him as. And he just can't say enough positive things about this family. Every time I call him, he's, oh yeah, we were there Sunday morning, and they gave us this kind of food, and it was wonderful. And it just makes such a difference when you actually meet someone and make that connection.
Connection is what it's all about. It's person to person, the ministry of one anothering. And you saw that play out in your relationship with Muhammad. So you had the initial interview with him. What brought about the follow-up, and what led toward it being more than an academic approach to gathering information for an article to actually moving into the relational area? And why do you think it took that turn?
When I first got involved with writing Muhammad's story, I did expect it to be very similar to the other books that I've co-written. So I thought it would be just about him, that I would be, a fringe voice in the book, and show up a very small amount, if at all. But as we started to work together, and as I started to better understand what he really needed, because again, I thought getting involved, I figured, well, he might need a little money, or he might need me to drive him somewhere, every once in a while, or to read his mail. But as we started to hang out more and to spend more time together, I realized that what he was looking for was a friendship. CWS could help him get the things that he needed. He had people who could answer questions that he could call. But what he was really looking for was someone who would spend time with him, who would sit in his house with him and drink coffee and talk about the news, and be someone to ask him about what his life was like in Syria. And so that was when things started to change, and it was also when things started to change in the book, because I realized that the book was not just going to be about Muhammad. It had to be about both of us, and it had to be about this sort of friendship that was forming very unexpectedly between us. And so that, I would say, after a month or two of kind of pursuing the book, is when I realized that it wasn't going to be this action-adventure story of a refugee fleeing, through bombs and across borders, but it was going to be a quieter story about friendship.
As you began to explore from the heart of faith that you had, which was as a believer in Jesus as the Messiah, and you were relating, did you feel compelled to draw upon your biblical understanding? Or did you filter through a biblical lens some of the things you were hearing so that you could observe with a heart for the Lord and respond to Him in kind? Did you see any indication in Him that His heart was being also changed from the Sunni value system and the Sunni Islamic system of Syria, which he grew up in, and there is no non-observant in the Muslim countries. There's no one who's non-observant. You pray 5 times a day. You pray the same prayers. You sit under the tutelage of an imam. He was now culturally immersed into something brand new. Did he maintain his Sunni Muslim tradition?
I got a sense from Muhammad that he was in, or is in, a very similar position that I see many of my Christian friends in, who are in their late 30s or early 40s and who feel a little disillusioned with the church, and they're not really sure where their faith journey is leading them. That's a sense that I got from Muhammad. So, once he arrived here, there is an Islamic community center here in Lancaster, but he did not attend services very often because he needed to work. And, our culture here in the U.S., Saturdays are some of the busiest work days, especially if you're working manual labor or in retail or those sorts of things. So he really, in order to provide for his family, had to work on a lot of those days. And he observed the religious holidays, the same way that someone who maybe would be marginally Jewish or marginally Christian would observe those days. And I'm not saying he's not Muslim, and I'm not saying that he doesn't practice Islam, but I just got a sense from him that he wasn't dogmatic about it, and there wasn't any sort of determination to maintain a certain religious standard when they came here. And we even spoke with his wife one time about she would still wear a covering, and my wife Miley asked her, have you ever thought about not wearing it? And she said, she would never have considered that in Syria, and she still would feel very uncomfortable not wearing it just because, she's so used to it. But she said she does have relatives who live here in the United States who have chosen not to wear it. And so, I got a sense from them that they were in a new place physically, in a new place, maybe in the way that they were thinking. And so that was interesting.
In your interactions with him, as you got to know each other, faith had to come up because that is the unique differentiator between Muhammad and Shawn. You're a believer in Jesus the Messiah. He is a monotheist. He is not a polytheist. So there is that connection back to Abraham. Whether or not that discussion came up or not didn't impact the way you treated him, but did it come up in conversation? Did you have an opportunity to share the gospel with him and to explain why you were like you were in developing a friendship with him and why you felt compelled by the teaching of the scriptures to be more open than the average person seemed to be in pursuing a friendship with him?
Yeah, I think one of the really difficult things with our friendship was just the communication barriers. We would often, when we would spend time together, we would often just sit there quietly for 5 or even 10 minutes at a time, because as soon as we started talking again, it would be a matter of trying to figure out, well, what's the word for this, and do you understand this word for that? And so it was difficult for us to go deep in those kinds of ways. We did talk about when he was celebrating Eid, which is a holiday that they celebrate that has to do with Abraham and the sacrifice that was provided. And so we talked a little bit about that and how interesting it was that 3 major world religions have that story in their heritage. And then one time while we were driving to Philadelphia, I asked him a little bit more about his religion, and I was able to understand that before the civil war came to Syria, people were not that concerned about whether you were Shia or Sunni. They weren't even really that concerned about if you were Christian. There was a Christian neighboring village to where he grew up, and they would spend time in that village, and they knew people there. He said that after the Civil War, it became much more important. People started to keep track of who was who was doing what, who was spending time with whom. And so I did pick up from him that he didn't like that. He much more preferred the community before, when people would mix and people would, be able to speak with people from other religions. Besides those things, I haven't really been able to go that deep. But, it's an ongoing relationship, and we speak on the phone now about once a week. He has moved to Michigan. And so, yeah, we'll see where that goes.
In your follow-up relationship with him, he's moved to a place where Islam is much more prevalent. Michigan being a place where it seems that there is a migration shift to larger Muslim populations and the debate about Sharia and whether or not there should be go and no-go zones. Are you concerned at all about his exposure to a much stronger, more virulent or vigilant or uh, observant Muslim community?
Yeah, I wondered about, what might happen when he moved out there. And it was interesting because they had some friends just west of Detroit, northwest in Lansing, in the Lansing area. And that is the largest Arabic population in the United States, is just outside of Detroit. And so we went to visit them when my wife and I were on our way to Grand Rapids one day. We stopped by to see the family, and he was very unhappy. I could tell he was very unhappy, and we talked more about it. And one of the reasons he was so unhappy was that he realized his wife and his boys had kind of reverted a little bit in their ability to speak English because they were spending so much time with other Arabic people and speaking Arabic. And that was something that bothered him. And within probably a month or two, they moved further west towards Grand Rapids, into a community that really isn't particularly Arabic. And he seems to be much happier. They have good work there. The schools are much better. The neighborhood they lived in Lansing, just outside Detroit, looked exactly like the Detroit, this kind of stereotypical pictures you see right now of Detroit, of boarded up houses and that sort of thing. So they were ready to get out of that situation, and they seem much happier now.
It's interesting to look at it from their point of view as to whether or not they wanted to assimilate into American culture. If we take a look at what the immigration laws are, is they do require you to swear allegiance to the United States. And for those who are under Sharia, they either have to lie because they do consider Sharia to be higher than the Constitution, or they wind up, as the CARE representative in Texas went on record as saying, is that we live in a culture and a community where Sharia is above the Constitution. And I think when you hear that, it kind of blanketly stereotypes all Muslims into a particular category. And what was the most challenging part for you as a believer? And what biblical teachings did you really draw on as you began to develop this relationship?
I think the hardest part for me as a believer was remaining patient with family members and friends who just aren't there yet, and I understand why people feel the way that they do. I mean, a lot of you mentioned rightly earlier how much my background has impacted, my ability to maybe have this friendship. And I think also I've traveled a lot. My wife and I lived in England for 4 years, and there were a lot of the same concerns over there in the early 2000s, especially right after 9/11. And we had Muslim friends there. And then I've been in Turkey co-writing a book with a missionary who lived there. I've been to Sri Lanka, and then I spent some time in Iraq last year. So I have to understand that my experience has kind of uniquely given me a particular view, and it may not be 100% accurate or correct. And so I need to be patient and to stay open with what my friends and family, their perspectives, and just kind of try to tend a graceful and kind and merciful dialogue among Christians as we discuss these things and explore these things, and understand that not everyone is where I'm at.
Shawn, for those who get a hold of a copy of Once We Were Strangers, what is it that you felt thematically, the undercurrent, the underlying thread that you wanted to weave into the book from beginning to end, that I would have a particular takeaway from this, and that I would have a different understanding from this narrative as to who I am in Christ, who I am as a believer, who I am as a fellow human being? If all are God's creation, and we know that He created these lines, He spoke over Ishmael, He said what Ishmael would be like, what his descendants would be like, So biblically, there is a role. That ultimate end role becomes a conflict, but then past the conflict, there are nations who come to faith, and we can read in Scripture what nations, what people groups do come to faith in Jesus. And so there is a battle to come. It is going to be the army of the Antichrist. We believe that it will be heavily Muslim populated, fueled, and funded, that even the Antichrist might come out of the Islamic world, maybe out of the Islamic capital of Mecca or out of Turkey, which is moving towards that Euro-Muslim kind of culture. What is it you want people to take away from this? Why should I put this on my compelling holiday read list and take this journey with you?
I think for me, the refugee part is important, and I think the Muslim Christian aspect is important. But I think even more important for our culture right now is this idea that we don't even know who our neighbors are. I mean, how can we love our neighbors when we don't even know their names? You know, when we don't know the person who lives beside us on either side or across the street. I would love if people would read this book, and maybe they have they feel no compelling feelings to become involved with refugee resettlement. That's fine. That's not my goal. My goal is to challenge us all to say, who is my neighbor, and what am I doing to love them? That was one of the aspects that hit me so much with spending time with Muhammad, was his observations of how lonely the people are here in the United States, and how empty our sidewalks are, and how empty our streets are, and how people don't leave their houses. And I think that as a Christian community within this American culture, we've too easily been swept up into that way of living. You know, that's kind of become the American way. And I think too many Christians have just taken that on as the way to live. And so I think if you could read this book and think, you know what, I'm going to reach out to my next door neighbor, whether they're white, black, Hispanic, Muslim, whatever it might be, I would consider that a win for the book.
It's so interesting you say that, because I often say when I teach, when you were pulling out of your driveway to come to this class tonight, did you happen to notice whether your next door neighbor's car was in the driveway?
Yeah.
And did it cause you to put the brakes on, put your car in park, leave it running, and go knock on their door and say, hey, I'm going to a Bible study, or I'm going to this event. Do you have plans tonight? Would you like to join me? Just make a decision, hop on in with me. I'll drive you. I'll bring you back. It'll just be an hour. I think you'd find it really interesting. And it causes husband and wife to look at each other and go, nope, we didn't look at the next door neighbors. We don't even know. We know the neighbor to the right because we share a fence, but we don't know the neighbor to the left. We don't know. We wave to the person across the street, but we don't know who they are. Yeah. And if God created, and he did in the Bible, neighborhoods, it was done. You had city walls. There was neighborhoods. If we have lost, the ministry begins at home, then it moves into the neighborhood, long before it moves into the church, then we've lost our way. And seeing the perspective from a Muslim Syrian refugee whose observation is, hey, America, you don't act kindly towards each other. You're not a friendly place. Is quite a commentary, and maybe all of us need to step out and recognize that as we look around, once we were strangers, but what are we going to do about it? And that's the challenge. Are you going to remain strangers and be complacent and only associate with those that look like you, sound like you, believe like you, and act like you? Are you going to step out the way Shawn Smucker did and formed a friendship with a Syrian refugee who taught him about loving his neighbor the way Jesus told us to love our neighbor as ourselves. Shawn Smucker, author of Once We Were Strangers, What Friendship with a Syrian Refugee Taught Me About Loving My Neighbor. Thank you for being with us here on Revealing the Truth.
Thanks so much for having me, Rabbi.
God bless you. We're going to take a short break, and when we return, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.